The anime begins by presenting the protagonist's life in his previous world, where every day he faced the same exhausting routine, going to work on an always crowded train and almost always rushing back home so as not to miss the last departure. His life went on without any changes until, suddenly, he reincarnates in another world and ends up becoming the lord of a remote village. With this new position, he begins to dream of developing that place and turning it into something better. Upon waking up, he realizes that his hand is far too small. Confused, he starts walking around the house, trying to understand what is happening. When he looks out the window, a girl appears and apologizes, calling him by the name Van. He also apologizes, explaining that he was simply admiring the scenery because he found it beautiful. The girl finds the way he speaks strange and asks how someone so young can use such complex words. Even though he is only 2 years old, Van is surprised to hear this and begins to reflect, until he realizes that he still retains all the memories of his past life. He concludes that this must be the phenomenon known as reincarnation. Little by little, Van recalls his new family and discovers that his brothers are named Mersha, Yard, and Sesta. Curious, he asks where exactly he is living. Soon after, he is taken to the dining table, where he finds his father and all his siblings gathered together. During the meal, Van receives attentive treatment from the maids and even jokes with them, thinking that this helps his image. However, while he is having fun, he clearly realizes that all the memories of his life in Japan remain intact. The father asks one of the sons to say what his plans for the day are. One of them answers, somewhat nervously, that he will study fire magic and battle tactics. Sesto comments that he intends to focus on learning magic. When it is Van's turn, he admits that he is not sure yet, but says that he would like to learn more about the culture and history of the country. The brothers are impressed by the answer, while the father starts to laugh, realizing that he has spoiled the boy quite a bit. Even at such a young age, Van shows unusual maturity. The father believes that he will inherit the qualities of both himself and his late wife, Mila, and that he will certainly awaken powerful fire magic. The father comments that he is eagerly awaiting the magic evaluation ceremony, which is held when children turn 8 years old. He has great confidence in Van's potential. The boy explains that, in that world, magical aptitude is extremely important, especially for nobles, who need to master offensive abilities to protect their territory. The 4 main elements are fire, water, wind, and earth, and anyone who awakens something different from these is seen as a source of shame. His father and brothers have affinities with the 4 elements. At another moment, Van asks whether that port is the only one available. The maid confirms it, explaining that there is a gigantic creature in the sea, which makes navigation dangerous. Van shows interest in learning more about the races of that world, surprising the girl with so much curiosity. She tells him about the existence of elves and dwarves. Some maids try to interrupt, saying that such topics are complicated for a child, but Van asks them not to worry, as he simply wants to learn. The topic then shifts to magical tools. The maid explains that certain crystals, gems, and minerals can store magical energy, allowing the creation of special items according to each person's affinity. At that moment, a man appears, slams his hand on the table, and reminds everyone that Van is only 2 years old and is still learning the basics. This man is the head butler. He tests Van by asking him to count the fingers on his hand. When the boy answers correctly, the butler is impressed and decides to become his tutor. For Van, those studies turn into a true torment. Even so, thanks to the intense lessons, he learns an enormous amount in a short time. 2 years pass, and he turns 4 years old. The scene shifts to Van training in combat with his favorite maid. Despite delivering precise strikes, she dodges them all and even mocks him, running away while laughing. Another maid appears, asking whether she is not afraid of being punished for disrespecting a noble, since that is considered a serious crime in that world. To settle the situation, Van simply gives the girl a light flick on the forehead and says that the matter is resolved. For an entire year, he trains swordsmanship every day and is already able to fight on equal footing with older children. Because he faces opponents of a similar age, the attacks end up being simple. But even so, his skill draws attention. The difference between his current life and his previous one is enormous, and everyone is impressed both by his talent and by his humility, despite coming from a noble family. While drinking water after training, Van comes across Dee, the vice captain of the Royal Knights Order. Dee asks to examine his hands and is surprised to find that they are still soft, without calluses. He had imagined that Van trained every night. The boy explains that he spends most of his time studying. Dee comments that Van studies far more than an ordinary child, which makes the boy understand the reason for his heavy routine. Excited, Dee offers to teach Van advanced swordsmanship and promises to make him the greatest swordsman in the kingdom. Van realizes that he speaks very seriously, but explains that he enjoys studying just as much as fighting and intends to devote himself to both. Dee agrees not to push him too hard, but makes it clear that he will be strict. He begins training him from morning until late afternoon, saying that the exercises are light. Although Van is certain that the man has no heart, a maid appears, praising the boy's effort, and Van thanks her. Despite the difficulties, he feels that his days in this new world are fun and full of meaning, something he had never experienced before. He decides to continue making the most of this new life. The following year, Van turns 6 years old and becomes known as a child prodigy. His routine, however, becomes far too heavy, filled with studies and intense training, making him feel increasingly tired. Because of this, he asks the maid to take him out for a walk. He says that he wants to go to the market, just once, so that he can stop being seen as a prodigy and live like an ordinary child. Upon arriving in the city, Van is delighted, as he has never been there before. Till explains that it is the largest market in the region. Suddenly, Van sees a man accompanied by a girl in terrible condition. When he asks what is going on, he discovers that the man intends to sell his own daughter as a slave. Hearing this, Van's heart tightens, deeply shaken by the scene before his eyes. Till explains that when families do not even have the bare minimum to eat, many end up selling their own children as slaves in order to survive. Van feels a painful weight in his chest as he realizes how cruel and unjust this reality is, considering it unthinkable to do such a thing to a child. At that moment, a woman appears and asks whether he is the Marquis's son. She introduces herself as Rosalie, an employee of the Merry Merchant Company, and states that she can arrange anything he might need. Van then asks what the price of the boy in front of him is. Rosalie asks whether the child has any magical aptitude, and the man replies that he only has talent for stealing, claiming that because of that he is worth no more than 3 large silver coins. Angered, the man begins to violently assault the boy and decides to take him to another shop. Outraged by the scene, Van decides to buy the child and offers 5 large silver coins. The man immediately accepts and hastily leaves the area. Van approaches the boy, asks if he can stand, and introduces himself, saying his name is Van. The other boy reveals that his name is Cramson. Van tells him that he is free to go wherever he wants. Till is confused, as she does not understand why Van bought a slave only to free him. Van explains that he did it simply to help and asks whether Cramson has anywhere to go. He then suggests that Cramson come to his house. Cramson replies that he does not believe the Marquis would allow a child of unknown origin into the mansion, but that if he were officially a slave, the situation would be different. Van asks if that would be acceptable, and the boy agrees. Rosalie suggests that the best course of action would be to form a master-servant contract. When the pact is made, a mark appears on Cramson's hand and will remain there until it is undone. Van thanks Rosalie, leaving her extremely happy, as she had never received a sincere thank you from a noble in her entire life. The next day, Cramson informs Van that Dee is waiting for him. Van asks him to say that he is not there, but the boy replies that Dee already knows. Van then asks Cramson to put on a glove, since the mark of the contract is not something pleasant to show. Cramson, however, says that he likes showing the mark, as it represents the bond he has with Van, and that makes him very happy. Van comments that he bought new gloves for him, and the boy agrees to wear them. Upon leaving the room, Cramson tells Dee that Van is not present, but the man swears that he saw Van enter earlier. Cramson believes that Dee only imagined it, perhaps because of the intense feelings he harbors for Van. As a result, Dee decides to take Cramson to train in Van's place. After that, 2 years pass, and everyone comments that Van has turned 8 years old. Expectations are enormous, and everyone can hardly wait for the result of the magical aptitude test. People are excited, believing that Van will become the Lord of the Lands. He is beloved by everyone, as he always treats people with kindness and humility, as if he were an ordinary person. The scene shifts to the family residence, where it is explained that all the children of the clan master the 4 elements, and that Van would certainly also have an aptitude for fire magic. After the test is conducted, rain begins to fall, and everyone is shocked to discover that Van has no affinity with any of the 4 elements. The only magic he can use is production magic. Among all types, this is considered the most unfortunate and despised. A man explains that this magic allows the creation of weapons and accessories using available materials and imagination, without the need for elemental affinity. He questions how Van intends to protect the people with an ability considered useless. The father, frustrated, recalls that both he and Van's late mother always had great firepower and cannot understand how his son could be born so useless. Consumed by rage, the man draws his sword, determined to put an end to it, saying that he was naive to believe Van would be a genius, when in reality he has become a source of shame. At that moment, one of Van's brothers steps in front of their father and proposes an alternative. He explains that there is a remote village that has never developed due to its isolated location. He suggests that Van be sent there. The village has just over 100 inhabitants, is located to the north in a mountainous region that produces nothing of note, and is also threatened by a powerful demonic beast. Nearby lies the territory of Count Ferdinand, and on the other side is the kingdom of Uranetta. The value of that village is minimal, being used only as a support point for training expeditions. It is a recently acquired territory whose loyalty to the Marquis's family is weak. If someone from the family were to take command, even symbolically, its prestige would increase. The father then decides to leave Van in the care of the strongest man in the village, and orders that he depart as soon as everything is prepared. He then leaves the room. The brother apologizes to Van, saying that it was the only possible solution. The news spreads quickly, and everyone is saddened by the boy's departure. Many people like him, and even Dee decides to accompany him to teach him everything he knows about magic. Van asks whether a knight can really go along, but Dee assures him that there is nothing to worry about, because wherever Van goes, he will go as well. The head butler decides to retire and accompany Van, saying that he will have a lot of fun helping him. With no other option, Van accepts that everyone will go with him. Till asks if he is all right, since he seems to be smiling so much. As he leaves the city, the people are saddened but accept the decision and wish Van good luck in his new life. The boy feels happy knowing that he has so many people he can trust. Thus ends the first episode. During the journey to the new city, the protagonist shows everyone that he has a great affinity with production magic. He wishes that this type of magic had some practical use, and after a long journey, they finally begin to approach the village where they will live from now on. The boy asks Kamzan not to push herself beyond her limits and says that, if she is already tired, she can return home without any problem. If he asked his brother for help, he would certainly take care of Van, but that does not matter to him. He promised to spend the rest of his life by Van's side, and he intends to keep that promise. He says that he will always be by the boy's side and that he would even put his own life on the line for him. Van becomes extremely embarrassed and asks if that sounds like a marriage proposal. The boy answers directly that he loves Van. Even finding the situation strange, he decides to continue the journey. However, without any warning, the carriage stops abruptly. When they look ahead, they realize that the village is facing serious problems and is under attack. Van quickly gathers his companions to set up a strategy and try to retake the village. Den comments that it is probably a group of bandits attacking the place. Van notices that the village is surrounded by archers on all sides, but strangely the arrows do not seem to have any effect at all. In front of the gate, there are many people gathered, while the villagers can only hide, unable to react. Making a quick estimate, Van calculates that there are about 50 enemies, a number far greater than theirs. Den suggests advancing and facing the attackers, believing that if they work together, they can win. One of the men considers this risky, since they are outnumbered. Den replies that he understands the risks, as he has been on the front lines many times. He knows that there will be wounded and even dead, but he believes that there is still a way to fight the enemy. One of the adventurers reminds them that they were hired only to escort them to the city and will not accept missions that put their companions at mortal risk. Den explains that that village is the first territory of his lord and shelters the first people under his rule. He asks when they intend to draw their swords. If not in a critical situation like that, the adventurer acknowledges Den's sense of honor, but states that this does not apply to them, as they are just adventurers. Even understanding this, Den asks that they at least protect Van. The butler, however, objects. He says that if Den dies, there will be no future, even if the village is recovered. Despite his age, he reveals that he is a mage of the 4 elements, surprising everyone. He explains that he will start by raising a barrier, while the adventurers attack from a distance behind it. When the enemies turn their attention to the barrier, D and his men will attack from the flanks. With coordinated surprise attacks, the chances of victory will be high. Van asks if the butler intends to fight as well. He replies that yes, because if he does not continue the attack, he will end up serving only as bait and D, and the others will die in vain. Van refuses to accept the death of his butler, but he insists, saying that his old eyes can still be useful and asks Van to accept this wish. Van objects again, reminding him of how much he has contributed to the Marquis family. He also asks D not to take risks, as they are still part of the main order of knights. If they lose D, who has great combat power, and the group's strategist, the territory will not be able to develop. Van then offers to serve as bait, but his maid refuses to allow that. Kamzan also volunteers to draw the enemy's attention. Van explains that he could not bear to see someone he loves die and says that Kamzan must live as long as possible, since she is now free. He decides to advance mounted on the carriage, attacking from the front, while the others carry out long-range attacks from the sides. Even facing resistance, Van states that he trains swordsmanship intensively every day with the vice commander of the knights, and will not die so easily. In his thoughts, he believes that even if he dies, it would be honorable for a lord to give his life for his people. He asks that they discard his body and not reveal his name, so as not to cause problems for the Marquis family. The scene shifts to the adventurers talking, saying that they have never met truly good nobles, only arrogant ones. One of them asks why he accepted the mission, and he replies that he intends to remain for a long time in the territory of Marquis Feltio. Van suddenly appears, thanking him for having accepted the job. After that, the man admits that perhaps there are exceptions among nobles. Returning to the present, the adventurer decides to accept fighting on the front line, this time entrusting his life to Van. Even with the boy's reluctance, he explains that if a child is willing to risk his own life, he cannot refuse. His companions agree, saying that they have always mocked the nobility, but have never met someone who remembered everyone's name like Van. Because of that, they believe they can trust him. Den also decides to advance, because protecting Van there is protecting the future of the Marquis family. Espada follows along, stating that as the lord of the lands, Van cannot act so recklessly and needs to understand the weight of being an heir. Thus, he adjusts the strategy, first the barrier, long-range attacks, D on the left and Ortho on the right. One of the adventurers observes the mage's power and is impressed. Another comments that if he had refused, he would have been willing to risk his own life in his place. He says that Van is a big fish and that, if possible, he would like to see him become king. Soon, the invaders begin to be attacked from behind, falling one after another. Confused, they try to react, but D advances with his companions, defeating many enemies with ease. Just with his aura, D makes many of them flee. One fighter tries to attack the support group and almost hits one of the women, but Van steps forward, cuts the enemy's legs, and Kamzan finishes the attack. Van warns that there may be more enemies in that area and asks for extra caution. The woman, in shock, looks at the boy and wonders what kind of child that is who has just saved her. After some time, all the enemies present in the area are subdued and captured, without anyone getting hurt. As soon as the adventurer receives the agreed reward, the mission will be considered complete. However, he begins to show a certain interest in Van. Maybe this will not bring money, but he seriously considers staying in that place. One of the members says that he cannot stay, because he already has a fixed job elsewhere. The woman, however, decides to remain since she was directly saved by Van. The others also choose to stay because they realize that he is different from all the other nobles they have known throughout their lives. In addition to still being just a child who has not even turned 10 years old, they want to closely follow what kind of person he will become in the future and decide to help him for a while. Van ends up being scolded by his maid, who says that if he intends to risk his own life in that way, he should use hers as bait instead of his, asking him to never commit such reckless actions again. At that moment, Dee appears telling everyone that it was an excellent victory. Espada observes that the villagers seem to all be gathered in front of the village gate. When they enter the place, Van introduces himself as the new lord of the village. But it soon becomes clear that the place is in terrible condition. An elderly man explains that he is the village chief and deeply thanks them for having been saved. Van asks if attacks like that have happened before, and the old man confirms, saying that just in that year the village was attacked several times. Van then questions why the village is so targeted, and the chief replies that in the time of Count Ferdinand, there was an order of knights that patrolled the region, but that no longer happens. Van understands that after the Marquis took over that area, the village began to run a serious risk of disappearing. He shows regret over his father's actions and believes that he does not know the real situation of the place, since, for paying few taxes, the village is not considered a priority for the nobles. Van explains that it is no use just complaining about the current condition of the kingdom. The village chief questions whether they really should hear this coming from a noble. Van asks everyone to calm down, stating that he is talking about the future of the village. He acknowledges that the responsibility of the nobility is great, and that, if they analyze the causes, there were probably failures in the laws established by the Berlinet royal family, founder of the kingdom. However, changing the laws of a kingdom is not a simple matter. Therefore, he asks if they know what to do besides just complaining. Van then presents 3 possible measures. The first is to create value for the village, making it impossible for the kingdom to ignore it. The second is to guarantee a constant source of income to hire mercenaries. The third is to reform and develop the village on their own. One of the residents explains that they have already tried to improve the village by themselves, but that it was not easy at all. Van replies that he understands the difficulties, but reinforces that now he is the lord of those lands and will not allow his people to starve. Even so, few show immediate hope. At that moment, Espada decides to speak. He explains that he served as head butler of the house of Marquis Ferdio and states that Van is an extremely talented young man, having been appointed lord of the lands at only 8 years old. He says that he was always treated as a prodigy. He also explains that Dee came to act as the village guard. From that point on, the villagers begin to create great expectations, since such important people are now there. One of the men asks if Van also masters the 4 elements. Van asks them not to create exaggerated expectations regarding his magic, saying that he can help in other ways. He himself recognizes that he still does not fully know his own abilities. A resident asks about the taxes, which are around 30%. Van decides to reduce it to only 10% of the harvest for a while, as he considers it essential to first guarantee a stable life for everyone. This decision greatly cheers the villagers. Van decides that the first step will be to reinforce the village walls and asks if anyone can help with that. A man replies that he can use earth magic, but that over time the structure will become just an ordinary wall. Van considers this sufficient for now and asks him to do it. The man performs the magic, leaving everyone impressed with his strength. Van thinks it is better to delay possible new attacks, but Dee says to leave that to them, as they will prepare several traps. Van asks everyone to cooperate, stating that if they work together, the village will certainly prosper. Upon leaving the village, Van decides to test his production magic to create something durable. One of the adventurers tries to break the object with his sword, but cannot, surprising everyone. At nightfall, a girl asks if Van's magic does not run out. He replies that he cannot perceive this limit, explaining that production magic consumes a great deal of magical power and that it is normally difficult to create even a single item. The next day, Van decides to build a house. Over time, he also intends to organize a harvest festival or something similar to a carnival. He wonders if he can really create an entire house with his power. But after imagining the result, he ends up building a large house in a short time, leaving everyone around impressed with his ability. Thus ends the second episode. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you next week with this same anime. See you later.